waiting list for organ transplants continues to grow faster than the number of transplants performed. In South Africa, the kidney transplant waiting list is approximately 4,300 patients. We manage to transplant about 6% of the waiting list annually. The average waiting time for public and private patients is 5 years. The United States manages to transplant about 25% of its waiting list each year. 22 people die each day on the waiting list, but even more people are added. The average waiting time for a kidney in the United States is also about 5 years. The requirements for being placed on the waiting list are important because they allow patients to qualify for an organ based on the basis of accepted medical criteria. If the patient is too healthy, they may not need it, and if they are too sick, they may not be able to benefit from it. It is important to specify at what point someone can be added to the waiting list, because this allows time on the waiting list to be used as a fair way to decide between two equal candidates. For kidney transplants, active time on the waiting list starts when dialysis is first commenced. For other organs, it begins as soon as the benefit of a transplant outweighs the risk. Demographic and medical data are recorded on the waiting list and are used to help allocate an organ should one become available. Probably the most important piece of information for the patient on the waiting list is their contact details. The telephone number must be current and functioning, as the patient has to answer the call if they are to be offered a deceased organ. After a set time period, protocols will state that the organ must be offered to the next patient on the list. Medical data on the waiting list is different for each organ. For liver recipients, this data includes bilirubin, creatinine, and INR. For heart and lung recipients, it is the amount of mechanical or medical support required to keep the patient alive. Kidney function can be effectively replaced by dialysis, so laboratory tests of kidney function are not used on the waiting list. But dialysis does not work forever. In South Africa, if you run out of effective dialysis options, you can apply to be prioritized on the kidney transplant waiting list. In order to be prioritized, the patient must be reviewed by an independent panel of doctors and assessed as having a life expectancy of under 6 months without a transplant. Prioritization to the top of the liver transplant waiting list is possible for certain conditions with good outcomes from urgent transplantation. For example, patients with acute fulminant hepatitis or those requiring urgent retransplantation for hepatic artery thrombosis. The life expectancy without a transplant in these scenarios is counted in hours and days. South Africa has so few transplant coordinators that messages of all urgent cases are sent directly to each one of them. For example, a call might go out, 2-year-old child with viral myocarditis in Cape Town, blood group O, 10 kilograms, height 72 centimeters. We then have to hope that a referral comes through in time. It is not only medical criteria that need to be met in order for a patient to be added to the waiting list. Recipients of an organ transplant must take lifelong immunosuppressive medication in order to prevent rejection and ensure a good outcome. Compliance with medication and regular attendance at follow-up is essential. A patient who repeatedly misses follow-up appointments and is non-compliant on medication will not be added to the waiting list unless there is evidence of a change in behavior. A patient who has an ongoing alcohol or drug addiction is also not a candidate for a transplant. Alcohol is especially relevant to liver transplants, where it is often the cause of liver failure, and continued alcohol abuse could compromise a liver transplant. An alcoholic is expected to be sober for 6 months prior to be listed for a transplant. We can all get sick, rich and famous, poor and unknown, but the rich and famous live under the scrutiny of public opinion. In 2007, the then South African Minister of Health, Dr. Mantu Shabalala Msimang, required a liver transplant. This caused much controversy because there were reports in the media regarding her alcohol habits. She would have qualified for a liver on the severity of her MELD score and being an appropriate size and blood group match for the donor. An assessment of her alcohol habits by a social worker would have been part of her assessment prior to listing. The fact that she passed away just 2 years after a transplant also added to the speculation. She was 67 years old when she received her transplant. 1 in 10 patients don't survive the first year after a liver transplant. In the United States, Dick Cheney, the vice president under George W. Bush, waited over 18 months with a left ventricular assist device prior to his heart transplant. Patients' clinical conditions can change while on the waiting list, so the list needs to be continually updated with the latest information to ensure appropriate allocation. Patients are taken off the waiting list when they become too sick. If they won't survive the operation, then they aren't transplanted. Would you give an organ to someone with a 5% chance of surviving? It might be their only chance, but with so many people dying on the waiting list who have a better chance of surviving, that does not maximize the benefit of the organs donated to society. All patients on the waiting list need their blood sent to the tissue typing laboratory every 3 months to make sure there's a fresh sample available that can be tested against potential deceased donors, should a donor become available. A positive cross-match means they can't receive an organ from that donor. They would reject it immediately. The waiting list must be audited to ensure the appropriateness of allocations and should be periodically reviewed together with transplant outcomes to ensure ongoing fairness in organ allocation practices. Patients on the waiting list are consented for transplantation at the time of listing and again immediately prior to transplant. There can be a lot of pressure on a recipient when they receive a call to come in for a transplant. The patient must decide if they would be willing to accept a marginal organ, for example, an extremely old donor or a donor with a higher infectious risk. For patients on the transplant waiting list, making such decisions is a reality, and not an easy one to make, for many of them don't know whether they will get another offer. To recap, waiting lists and their criteria are essential to ensure that appropriate candidates are listed for transplantation. Waiting lists serve as the basis for organ allocation, and they continue to grow at a pace beyond organ donation across the world.